In the skies over North Vietnam, 1967, a silent, high-stakes duel is unfolding. But this isn't a dogfight between fighters and bombers. This is a clash between America's most advanced unmanned technology and the very heart of Soviet air defense. On the ground, radar operators, trained on the vast plains of the USSR, are staring intently at their scopes. Suddenly, a blip appears. It's incredibly fast, unbelievably small. It behaves like no aircraft they have ever seen. It flies directly into the teeth of their most lethal defenses on a mission with no return. For the men of the Soviet Air Defense Forces, it was a ghost they couldn't catch, a mystery that threatened their entire defensive network. This is the story of how Soviet radar was baffled by US Firebee drones that flew suicide missions over Vietnam. Starting in 1964, the United States was determined to dismantle North Vietnam's formidable air defenses. This wasn't just a few scattered guns. It was a complex, integrated web of early warning radar, heavy anti-aircraft artillery, and deadly surface-to-air missiles. And this entire system was provided, and in many cases operated, by Soviet advisors. The cost of mapping this deadly grid was steep, measured in lost pilots and downed aircraft. To reduce the human toll, the U.S. turned to a revolutionary, unmanned asset, the Ryan Model 147. Codenamed Lightning Bug, its crews simply called it the Firebee. Its missions were straightforward and utterly ruthless. Fly straight into hell and die gathering secrets. By mid-1966, Operation Rolling Thunder, America's sustained bombing campaign against the North, was in full force. But American losses, particularly to surface-to-air missiles, or SAMs, were mounting at an alarming rate. The Soviet-built SA-2 guideline missile system, guided by its fan-song engagement radar, had proven brutally effective, claiming hundreds of American aircraft. The U.S. desperately needed to understand this system's capabilities, its radar frequencies, and its operational patterns. To do that, they needed a perfect, disposable reconnaissance platform. That platform was the Ryan AQM-34 Firebee. Originally designed as a simple target drone for training, it was secretly transformed by a high-tech program run out of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Operationally, these drones fell under the control of Strategic Air Command's 100th Strategic Reconnaissance Wing. Launched from the belly of modified DC-130 Hercules aircraft, these drones were true technological marvels for their time. Stretching just 29 feet long with a tiny 13-foot wingspan, they were dwarfed by any manned fighter. Powered by a single General Electric turbojet, they could scream across the sky at over 500 knots, cruising at altitudes well above 60,000 feet, far beyond the reach of conventional anti-aircraft guns. The main characters in this story weren't pilots strapped into cockpits. They were remote operators inside the DC-130 mothership, and teams of highly skilled technicians who meticulously prepared each drone for its one-way journey into enemy territory. Men like Captain James G. Jim Reed, a launch control officer. His job was to guide the drone towards its target area before handing off control to ground stations that would steer it through the most dangerous airspace on the planet. And on the other side, there were men like Senior Lieutenant Alexander Ivanov, a radar officer with the 54th Anti-Aircraft Rocket Brigade. He was part of a Soviet unit embedded with the North Vietnamese Army near the heavily defended city of Hanoi. His entire world was the eerie green glow of a P-12 Spoon Rest early warning radar scope. His mission was to find and identify incoming threats for the lethal SA-2 SAM batteries under his protection. This was more than just a battle. It was a technological chess game of the highest order. A typical mission began in the relative safety of the sky over the Gulf of Tonkin. Inside the DC-130, the drone launch officer would initiate the pre-launch sequence. The Firebee, clamped under the wing, would come to life. Its engine would spool up with a high-pitched whine, and with a final check, it would drop away from the mothership, accelerating rapidly towards the coast. On the ground in North Vietnam, Lieutenant Ivanov's radar screen would flicker. The drone's radar cross-section was minuscule, a deliberate design feature. To the Soviet radar, it appeared as a faint, fleeting contact, almost indistinguishable from atmospheric noise or ground clutter. It was too fast for a conventional recon plane and too high for most interceptors. The first few times these phantoms appeared, the Soviet and Vietnamese crews were baffled. They would track the contact, trying to get a lock, but it would often just vanish, or it would fly a pre-programmed, erratic path designed specifically to confuse their systems. The Firebees were equipped with electronic countermeasures, or ECM pods, that could jam the fan-song radar, and special receivers designed to listen in on the Soviet frequencies. The drone's primary mission was to trigger the SAM sites. By flying directly at them, it forced the radar operators to light up their guidance systems. The moment they did, the Firebee's sensors would record every detail: the frequency, the pulse rate, the beam width. This was the electronic intelligence, the ELINT, that was worth more than gold. Once the drone gathered this data, it would transmit it back to the DC-130 or to listening posts. And then, its main job done, it would often continue on its pre-programmed path, flying deeper into the air defense network. The Soviet and Vietnamese crews, frustrated and determined, would launch their SA-2 south. For them, shooting down this elusive target became a matter of pride. They would fire missile after missile at the tiny drone. Some Firebees were indeed shot down, their fiery demise a small victory for the defenders. But each missile fired was a data point for the Americans. They learned the SA-2's engagement envelope, its kill probability, and its limitations. However, not all Firebees were suicide missions. Some of the more advanced models were designed for recovery. After completing their run through the gauntlet, they would fly to a designated recovery point over the ocean. A parachute would deploy, and a specialized helicopter, dangling a complex grappling hook system, would swoop in and snatch the drone right out of midair. This was an incredibly difficult maneuver, requiring immense skill from the helicopter pilots. A successful recovery meant the drone and its precious intelligence package could be analyzed, refurbished, and sent back into the fight. These recovered drones provided invaluable information. Technicians could examine the onboard systems to see exactly how the enemy had tried to jam it or shoot it down. But more importantly, the electronic data it collected was rushed to analysts. They compiled a complete electronic order of battle for North Vietnam's air defenses. They knew where the SAM sites were, what frequencies they used, and how they operated. This intelligence was a game changer. It was used to develop new ECM pods for American fighter bombers, like the F-105 Fenderchief and the F-4 Phantom. These pods could now effectively jam the fan-song radar, giving pilots a crucial edge. The data also helped create the Wild Weasels, specialized aircraft whose sole mission was to hunt and destroy SAM sites. Armed with the Firebee's intelligence, they knew exactly what to look for and where to find it. The effectiveness of the SA-2 network began to plummet. American aircraft losses to SAMs dropped significantly. The ghost in the machine had given them the key to survival. The Soviet advisors were caught in a frustrating loop. They knew something was systematically mapping their defenses, but they couldn't reliably stop it. They would move their radar sites, change their frequencies, and alter their tactics. But the Firebees kept coming, adapting with new sensors and new flight profiles. It was a relentless, invisible assault that undermined the very foundation of their defensive strategy. For the radar crews on the ground, it was a deeply unnerving experience. They were fighting an enemy with no pilot, no fear, and no hesitation. It was a machine built for one purpose: to sacrifice itself for information. The legacy of the Firebee drone program in Vietnam is immense. It was one of the first large-scale uses of unmanned aerial vehicles in a combat role, paving the way for the drones that are now ubiquitous on the modern battlefield. The program proved that a small, relatively cheap, unmanned platform could take on some of the most sophisticated air defense systems in the world and win. It saved the lives of countless pilots and fundamentally changed the nature of electronic warfare. The silent duel over North Vietnam was a critical chapter in military history. It was a story of ingenious engineering, daring operational planning, and the cold, hard logic of the Cold War. The Firebee was more than just a drone. It was a technological specter that haunted the Soviet-built air defenses, a ghost in the machine that exposed their secrets and turned the tide of the air war. The lessons learned from those high-risk, one-way missions are still relevant today, reminding us that sometimes the most effective weapon is not the one that carries the biggest bomb, but the one that carries the most valuable information. Imagine a secret war fought not by pilots, but by machines. A war of ghosts and phantoms played out in the dark skies over North Vietnam. This is the story of Operation Buffalo Hunter, a top-secret program that pitted sophisticated American drones against the might of the Soviet air defense network. It was a high-stakes game of cat and mouse that pushed technology and people to their absolute limits. The missions began under the cloak of darkness. From bases in Thailand, a massive DC-130 Hercules transport plane would lumber into the night sky. But this was no ordinary Hercules. Bolted under its right wing were two sleek, unmanned aircraft, the Ryan Firebee drones. As the mothership reached a designated point over Laos or the Gulf of Tonkin, it would climb to 20,000 feet. The air was tense. The crew inside the DC-130 would run through their checklists, their voices calm but focused. Then the command would come. Launch command, standby, release. The Firebee drone would drop from its pylon, falling for several heart-stopping seconds through the blackness. Then, with a puff of smoke, its jet engine would ignite, roaring to life. The drone was now on its own. It climbed steeply, an autonomous ghost guided by a pre-programmed inertial navigation system. Its destination, the heart of North Vietnam's Red River Delta, one of the most heavily defended pieces of airspace on the planet. By 3 a.m, the drone would cross the fence into hostile territory. Deep inside underground command bunkers near Hanoi, the tension was palpable. Soviet advisors worked alongside their Vietnamese counterparts, their eyes glued to flickering radar scopes. On a typical night, the screens would paint large, slow-moving blips. Those were likely B-52 Arc-Light strikes, the massive bombers on their way to pound targets. Faster, more erratic contacts might be RF-4, Sea Phantom reconnaissance jets. But then, something new would appear. A tiny, fast-moving signature. The Firebee's radar cross-section was minuscule, comparable to a large bird, not an aircraft. On the primitive Soviet-made radar screens, it would flicker, fade, and then reappear, a phantom echo that defied a clean track. A Soviet advisor, let's call him Senior Lieutenant Ivanov, would mutter to his Vietnamese colleague, "What is that?" The contact was an enigma. It didn't behave like any known aircraft. It didn't deviate from its course, flying a straight, predictable, and seemingly suicidal path directly toward known surface-to-air missile, or SAM, sites. It emitted no communication signals that they could intercept. Its speed was constant, its altitude extremely high. It was a ghost in the machine. By 3:30 a.m., the drone would penetrate the inner defensive ring around the major cities of Hanoi or Haiphong. This is when the real game began. The fan-song fire control radars of the SA-2 missile sites would lock onto the intruder. And at that exact moment, the Firebee's secret weapons came alive. On board the drone, a suite of advanced sensors codenamed Combat Angel began its work. A radar homing and warning receiver, pinpointed the exact frequency and location of the tracking radar, gathering precious intelligence. A state-of-the-art side-looking radar began mapping the ground terrain with stunning detail, revealing camouflaged missile sites, supply depots, and command posts that were invisible to normal overhead photography. And all the while, a high-resolution panoramic camera was silently snapping hundreds of photographs, capturing a detailed portrait of the enemy's defenses. The tension was electric on both sides of the conflict. Aboard the orbiting DC-130 mothership, American operators monitored the drone's telemetry, a stream of data showing it was being painted or lit up by multiple enemy radars. They watched as their unmanned asset flew deeper and deeper into the hornet's nest, knowing it was collecting priceless information with every second it survived. On the ground, the Soviet and Vietnamese battery commanders grew increasingly frustrated. Their sophisticated radar systems, designed to track large bombers, struggled to maintain a lock on this tiny, elusive target. The phantom blip was infuriating. After minutes of failed attempts to get a clear picture, a fateful decision would be made. Engage. The crisis for the Soviet air defense system was one of complete technological bewilderment. The SA-2 guideline missile was a fearsome weapon. It was designed to kill large, manned bombers like the B-52 or fighter bombers like the F-105 Thunderchief. Its massive warhead relied on a proximity fuse designed to detonate near a substantial aircraft, sending a cloud of shrapnel to tear through its fuselage and systems. The Firebee drone was neither large nor manned. It was a tiny sliver of metal, packed with electronics, screaming through the stratosphere. Target locked. Launch one. With a deafening roar, a 35-foot-long spear of flame would leap from its launcher. The SA-2 missile would accelerate to over 3 times the speed of sound, guided by the fan-song radar's delicate beams, streaking toward the tiny drone. The Firebee, now aware of the imminent threat, would initiate its pre-programmed electronic countermeasures, attempting to jam the missile's guidance. But its most effective defense was simply its size. The missile would close the distance in seconds. Its proximity fuse would trigger, just as designed. A massive explosion would blossom in the night sky, a cloud of white-hot shrapnel expanding at incredible speed, designed to shred the aluminum skin and hydraulic lines of a fighter jet. In the American command plane, the drone's telemetry signal would flicker. On the ground, the radar blip would disappear in the flash of the explosion. A direct hit. But then, something unbelievable would happen. In many cases, the drone would emerge from the smoke and fire, still flying. The blip would reappear on the radar screens. The shrapnel pattern, so deadly to a large aircraft, was simply too diffuse to guarantee a kill on a target so small. The fragments would whistle past the drone, or perhaps make a few small holes, but fail to hit anything critical. The Soviet operators would stare at their screens, utterly incredulous. Direct hit. Why is it not falling? They had fired their best weapon, seen it detonate perfectly, yet the target continued on its relentless path as if nothing had happened. Some missiles, confused by the drone's tiny radar return, would detonate too late, or not at all, self-destructing harmlessly in the distance. The psychological toll on the Vietnamese and Soviet crews was immense. They were firing missile after missile, sometimes dozens in a single night, at these phantom targets with little to no effect. They were wasting precious and expensive ordnance on an unmanned machine. It was demoralizing, confusing, and exposed a critical vulnerability in their air defense system. The Buffalo Hunter drones were, in essence, flying intelligence sponges. Their primary mission wasn't just to take pictures. It was to provoke the enemy, to force them to turn on their radars, to fire their missiles, and in doing so, to reveal their secrets. Every radar signal, every missile launch, every photograph was a piece of a puzzle. When pieced together, this intelligence allowed the U.S. to map out North Vietnam's entire air defense network, creating safe corridors for manned bomber strikes and planning missions to destroy the SAM sites. The Firebee drones of Operation Buffalo Hunter were the unsung heroes of the air war. They were pioneers of unmanned warfare, the ancestors of the drones we see today. They flew the most dangerous missions deep into the heart of enemy territory, and in their silent, ghostly flights, they changed the course of the war, saving countless lives by exposing the enemy's secrets. The drones just kept coming. Not one by one, but in relentless waves. Imagine this. Soviet air defense crews, thinking they're in an epic duel, chase after a single American Firebee drone. They lock on, they launch their deadliest missiles, and maybe they even score a hit. But while all their attention is focused on that one tiny target, other drones are slipping right through the gaps. They're like ghosts in the machine, silently mapping out every missile site, meticulously recording every radar frequency, and taking high-resolution photographs of the entire complex air defense network. This wasn't a quick, dramatic battle. It was a slow, creeping crisis that unfolded over weeks and months. The Soviets had built this formidable shield, this impenetrable wall of steel and fire, at enormous expense. And now, they were watching it being systematically taken apart, reverse-engineered by a pilotless machine that seemed to treat their most advanced missiles as nothing more than a data collection exercise. The Americans weren't just throwing drones away. They were trading them for information, and it was a trade that was paying off massively. The real turning point in this conflict didn't come from a heroic dogfight between ace pilots. It came from a grueling, relentless campaign of attrition and analysis. On one side, the Americans were learning and adapting with every single drone that was shot down. On the other, the Soviets were growing more and more desperate to solve this infuriating riddle. How could a simple, unmanned aircraft make their entire defense system look obsolete? For the United States, the secret was in the data. When a Firebee was inevitably hit, and believe me, many were, it wasn't always the end of the story. This is where the story gets even more incredible. The Americans would launch daring combat search and rescue missions, known as CSAR, not just to rescue pilots, but to recover the film canisters and sensor tapes from the wreckage of these downed drones. These weren't just pilots risking their lives for other pilots. They were risking their lives for a roll of film. And the intelligence they brought back was priceless. Back in Washington, D.C., at the National Photographic Interpretation Center, analysts would pore over every inch of the recovered imagery. Suddenly, they knew everything. They had the exact layouts of the surface-to-air missile sites, the precise positions of the anti-aircraft artillery batteries, and even the locations of hidden underground command bunkers. It was like being handed the enemy's playbook. But the real game-changing breakthrough wasn't photographic. It was electronic. The Firebees were equipped with special receivers that listened to the enemy's radar. This data allowed American engineers to develop and perfect electronic jamming pods, like the famous NALQ 71-87. What this meant was that manned strike aircraft, the F-4 South and F-105s, could now fly into the most heavily defended areas in the world, carrying pods specifically tuned to blind the exact radar frequencies the drones had identified. The drone's suicide run had given them the key to unlock and neutralize the terrifying SA-2 guideline missile threat. On the Soviet side, the turning point was one of grim, frustrated adaptation. By studying the captured wreckage of the Firebees and painstakingly analyzing their own radar data, their engineers finally understood what they were up against. This wasn't some revolutionary new stealth plane with a pilot inside. It was an unmanned reconnaissance drone, and it required a whole new set of tactics. So they adjusted. They started to hold their fire against single, small, high-flying contacts. Why waste a multi-million-dollar missile on a cheap drone? They began to save their precious SA-2 South for larger, confirmed manned aircraft strikes. For the lower-flying drone variants, They tried to use their ZSU-23-4 Shilka radar-guided anti-aircraft guns, and even conventional flak, hoping to swat them out of the sky with sheer volume of fire. They also worked frantically to modify the proximity fuses on their missiles, trying to make them more sensitive to these smaller targets. But here's the thing about this technological arms race. For every Soviet countermeasure, the American Buffalo Hunter program, which ran the drones, evolved. Just when the Soviets thought they had a handle on the high-altitude drones, the Americans introduced new Firebee variants. The 147TE was designed to fly at treetop level, right under the radar, to map out the AA gun positions. The 147SC carried even more sophisticated electronic intelligence suites, hoovering up every signal it could find. Then came the AQM-34M, which had an extended range for even deeper penetrations into enemy airspace. The technological cat-and-mouse game was accelerating at a dizzying pace. But the United States, thanks to the invaluable sacrificial data gathered by those early drones, now held a decisive, almost unfair advantage. The Firebees had not only mapped the battlefield, they had given American pilots the electronic keys to survive in it. This wasn't just about winning a battle. It was about changing the very nature of air warfare, proving that information, gathered by an army of pilotless spies, was the most powerful. In the shadowy world of Cold War espionage, some of the greatest battles were fought not by soldiers, but by machines. This is the story of one such machine, a silent hero of the Vietnam War, whose story has remained classified for decades. It's the story of the Ryan Firebee and the top-secret program known as Buffalo Hunter. Imagine this, a small jet-powered drone, originally designed as nothing more than a target for missile practice, being repurposed for one of the most dangerous missions imaginable. Its task? To fly deep into the heart of North Vietnam, into the most heavily defended airspace on the planet, an area codenamed Route Pack 6. This was the domain of the deadly SA-2 guideline missile, a Soviet-made weapon that had been claiming American aircraft at an alarming rate. For American pilots, flying into Route Pack 6 was a life-or-death gamble. But for the Firebee drone, it was just another mission. Launched from under the wing of a modified DC-130 Hercules mothership, these unmanned spies would streak across the sky, their cameras capturing vital intelligence that no human pilot could safely obtain. The Buffalo Hunter program was born out of desperation and ingenuity. The United States needed to know where the enemy's missile sites were, how they operated, and how to defeat them. Sending manned reconnaissance flights, like the U-2, was simply too risky after one was famously shot down over the Soviet Union. The solution was the Firebee, a disposable asset that could gather priceless information without risking a single human life. Between 1964 and 1975, these little drones flew over 3,400 combat missions. The odds were stacked against them. They were hunted by MiG fighter jets and targeted by hundreds of surface-to-air missiles. Of course, many were shot down. Over 550 Firebees were lost during the war. But this was considered an acceptable price for the incredible intelligence they brought back. And what intelligence it was! The data gathered by the Firebees was nothing short of revolutionary. They provided over 80% of all the missile site photography for the missions planned in Route Pack 6. Think about that. 4 out of every 5 bombing runs aimed at taking out those deadly missile sites relied on images taken by these unmanned drones. The images and electronic signals they collected allowed American strategists to map out the entire North Vietnamese air defense network. They learned the SA-2's secrets, its radar frequencies, its guidance patterns, and its vulnerabilities. This information was instrumental in developing new electronic countermeasures, jamming equipment, and evasive tactics that would ultimately save countless American aircrew lives. The Wild Weasels, brave pilots who flew missions specifically to hunt and destroy SAM sites, owed much of their success to the pathfinding work of the Firebee. The recovery of these drones was a high-stakes operation in itself. After completing its photo run, the Firebee would deploy a parachute, and a specialized helicopter, dangling a massive grapple, would swoop in to literally snatch the drone out of mid-air. It was a spectacular and dangerous maneuver, requiring immense skill from the helicopter crews. If a mid-air recovery failed, the drone would parachute down, hopefully into the ocean, where Navy frogmen would retrieve it. Every piece of film, every bit of data, was precious. For the Soviet Union, which had supplied the SA-2 system to North Vietnam, the success of the Firebee was a major shock. Their premier air defense system, which they believed was nearly invincible, was being systematically outsmarted by a modified target drone. It exposed critical vulnerabilities and forced them to rethink their entire air defense strategy. The Buffalo Hunter program spurred the Soviets to accelerate their own development of unmanned aerial vehicles and counter-drone technologies. This silent duel in the skies over Vietnam was, in many ways, the world's first true robotic war, a contest of silicon and steel that set the stage for the drone warfare of the 21st century. The entire program was shrouded in such intense secrecy that for decades, the veterans who worked on it couldn't speak about their service. While the pilots of the manned support aircraft received individual medals like the Distinguished Flying Cross, the incredible contribution of the entire team, the launchers, the controllers, the recovery crews, and the intelligence analysts was largely unrecognized at the time. It wasn't until much later that the 100th Strategic Reconnaissance Wing, which ran the program, was awarded a Presidential Unit Citation for its extraordinary heroism. The legacy of the Ryan Firebee and the Buffalo Hunter program is profound. It proved, beyond any doubt, the viability of unmanned aircraft in high-threat, strategic reconnaissance roles. It was a precursor to the modern drones we see today, from the Predator to the Global Hawk. This wasn't a story of grand infantry charges or dogfights in the sky. It was a silent war of wits, fought with radio waves, computer programs, and pre-programmed courage. The Firebee was a machine without a soul, but its mission saved the lives of countless